Again, welcome. I'm Dr. Stacy Bewley, and I am the supervisor of ECE Community Relations for Jefferson County Public Schools. This is my favorite part of my job, is doing some parent outreach and working with parents to help them navigate through special education, because it's, it can be overwhelming at times. And I am joined by my colleague, Kim Vinegar, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Vinegar, and I'm the supervisor for Section 504 for JCPS. And I've been in this position for 3 years, and I spent the other 20 some years of my career in special education. So I'm well versed in both. And I'm just excited to be here with you guys and give you the tools that you need to transition to college.
Thank you, Veronica, for your suggestion to turn on the captions. I appreciate that. So our first, we're going to have a panel discussion, and in my email I sent to the presenters, I said that we would present a question and we'd pose that to individuals. And then if your institution has a different process or procedure altogether, please add to that. If not, we probably don't want to say the same thing 7 or 8 times, right? And that will give us more time to interact with families at the end in our breakout sessions. But no one can introduce you quite like you can. So this is a question for everyone. I'd like you to just introduce yourself, talk about the university that you represent, and include your role in the department within the university. Someone can just unmute and.
Well, I am never shy, so I'll go first.
You are never shy.
Matt Springer. I work at Indiana University Southeast, which is the IU just across the river. I'm the director of disability services. Been there for a while, probably about 15 years now. And it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
I'll go next. I'm Colleen Martin, and I am the director of the Disability Resource Center at the University of Louisville. And maybe I'll just call on somebody because that makes it less awkward. Veronica, you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Veronica. I'm with Western Kentucky University. I'm the Deaf and Hard of Hearing coordinator. Nice to be here. Dr. Crow.
Hi, everyone. I'm Peggy Crow. I have the pleasure of working with Veronica in the Student Accessibility Resource Center here at Western Kentucky University. And I serve in dual roles. I'm the director of the SARC, and I'm also the director of our counseling center. I only see people that have already spoken, Stacy, so I apologize. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
That's all right. Dr. Beach.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Beach. I'm the director of the Disability Resource Center at the University of Kentucky.
I can go next. I'm Ken Ashlock. I'm the director of the Disability Services Office here at Murray State.
I can go next. My name is Summer Masanji, and I'm with the Jefferson Community and Technical College, and I'm the testing coordinator with the Access Resourceability Center there.
I can go next. My name is Krista Schutz-Hampton, and I'm the director of the Accessibility Resource Center at Bellarmine University.
Okay, Krista.
Awesome. Is Ingrid Thomas with us? I didn't see her come in, but I just want to check. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for being here, whether you are a family member, a student, or you represent one of our university partners, we appreciate your time. So we'll start with Bellarmine. Krista, can you tell us what is the process for accessing services through your office?
Sure. So the process, we ask for students to reach out to our office in order to start the process. There's an online system called Accommodate, where a student would submit a request for services, and that kind of gets the ball rolling. That sends us an email letting us know that the student's interested. We then reach out to them, make sure that we get documentation from the student, and then we schedule a time to meet with them. We'll review the documentation we have on file, talk with them about their experiences and what accommodations they've used in the past, if any, and then we talk about appropriate accommodations in the Bellarmine setting. It's individualized, kind of based on the student and the documentation provided.
Does anyone have a different institutional process for accessing services? Okay, thank you.
All right, that all seems pretty similar. Hold on, we're having technical difficulties over here. That's what happens when you're in the same room.
It's not letting me mute myself.
It won't. Oh. There you go. All right, sorry, everyone. This next question is for Matt. At IUS, what type of documentation are needed to access services through your office?
Great question. And I bet it's pretty much the same answer as a lot of my peers, but it depends. In that the documentation needs to be based on, the appropriate person diagnosing or working with that specific issue. For example, if you have a learning difference, some of my favorite people have learning differences, such as myself. But that would be that would be evaluated through an educational psychologist, probably through the school system. Back in the day, there used to be a eye doctor in the area that liked to diagnose dyslexia, and that's just not how that works. Or conversely, if you have a visual impairment that needs to be accommodated, great, but that would need to come from an eye doctor and not from an educational psychologist. So it needs to be from the right person. There are some questions I get a lot. What does it have to be within 3 years or 2 years or 1 month or 5 days? And the answer to that is it needs to be adult normed. So it's sort of the difference between what's current and what's recent. Does documentation have a shelf life? Not necessarily. So if it's adult normed, like for a learning difference, but it's 4 years old and not 3 years, is it still okay? It probably is. It may not be recent, but as long as it's current, or in other words, as long as the documentation describes the individual right now, then yes, documentation guidelines are on my website. Documentation guidelines are pretty standard across higher education. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that parents may have. And I'm sure my colleagues are the same.
Wonderful. Does anybody have a different take on that? I just like the verbiage of adult normed. That cleared up a lot of things for me as an educator. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll give you a peek behind the curtain a little bit. If there's the initial of a C next to the alphabet soup that is our profession, the C probably stands for children. And if there's an A, again, in the alphabet soup of our profession, well, it's probably for adult. So there you go. There's your ed psych degree, everybody.
One thing I'd also like to point out is we have a lot of parents ask about whether the 504, the IEP is acceptable. And while different schools take different viewpoints. So I don't want to speak for anybody else, but typically we appreciate that as a historical document, but we typically need more diagnostic information in terms of making an accommodation.
That's a great point.
Dr. Beach used the word that I would use too, great historical information, but that's exactly what it is. It lets us know what services were put in place, but not the why. And it's the why that we're really trying to get to.
I would also like to add, it would depend on what accommodations the individual is seeking. You know, as David had mentioned, you know, a 504 plan or an IEP, that would be enough to get a student connected with our office and to get it started. But if a student was looking for, you know, a housing accommodation, a lot of times those documents only include things related to the academic side. It doesn't really address, you know, what the student might need in the residential community. So it would just depend on what accommodations they're seeking. So that would require, you know, a different form of documentation, typically a letter from their doctor that might describe, you know, some of the challenges or the chronic health impairment that may require a student to have a private room or a first floor housing assignment, something like that. So it would just depend on what they're seeking.
Well, let me ask you all this, and I know this isn't my show. If a student comes to you and they have an IEP and they have a 504 plan, but they don't have everything, do you just leave the student and just say, well, go back and come back when you have the stuff? Or are you able to help them then, maybe some temporary accommodations, and work with them as they gather the appropriate documentation?
Yeah, we would allow them to, for example, if a student had a learning difference and they were seeking additional time to take an exam and they provide us with their most recent IEP, say from their senior year of high school, then we would accommodate based off of that. And then we would encourage them to reach out to a couple of offices on our campus that could help them get some more formal assessments completed. So it's kind of the process that we would take.
We would do the same.
We do also at Bellarmine.
Awesome. So whose responsibility, and this is for summer, this question is for summer, whose responsibility is it then to gather that documentation and to provide it to your office?
And so it's the student's responsibility to gather their own documentation and to submit it to their art coordinator in order for the accommodations to be determined.
Anyone have a different process there?
I will say that if a student is involved with the counseling center on Bellarmine's campus, we will get the student to sign a release of information and forward that over to the counseling center just to initiate the process and kind of help them to give us forward the documentation that we're needing. But we encourage the student to talk with their therapist in the counseling center as well. But we'll kind of assist when it's the on campus where we already have kind of a working relationship with the counseling center.
Okay, Mr. Ashlock from Murray, how often do students need to provide that documentation to the university? Is it good the whole time they're there, or do they need to resubmit it yearly?
Yeah, I would say if for the most part, documentation would cover the entire time that they're a student here, unless something changes with their condition or new diagnoses come along, then that would be appropriate for students to submit additional documentation as those things may change. We do require some documentation for students to submit annually. For example, if a student is looking at a housing accommodation based off of a mental or emotional disorder, then we would require them to provide some documentation every year to help us understand that it's still a continued need for them from one year to another, particularly in the area of requesting an emotional support animal. Usually that documentation would only be valid for 1 year. And so if a student is returning for their second year and they would like to continue to have that accommodation, then they would have to resubmit new documentation so that we have a better understanding that it is a continued need for them. But for the most part, academic accommodations, usually documentation that they provide initially would be enough to kind of cover the entire time that they would be working with us.
One thing that I would add to that would be, just because documentation is good for our purposes doesn't mean that an outside entity is going to be okay with the documentation that we've accepted. So if students are going on to graduate school, professional school, or going to have to take some sort of licensure exam, the requirements of those outside entities may be more stringent than what they are at the university level. So that's something for students to be aware of.
That's a great point. Thank you. There was a question in the chat, and this group may or may not know the answer to that, but the question is, if a student needs residential accommodations, is there an upcharge for those accommodations?
No, absolutely not. Or any, it's a matter of equity. So for the student to have the same opportunity to live as all the other students, that's an adjustment that's made. I mean, there may be associated costs, but it would only be equitable to what other students that don't have a disability would have to pay. But so if someone needed a single room, they wouldn't be charged the single rate.
Okay.
That's kind of, so that's usually the question that we get, that they would be charged the same as everybody else, whether they had a roommate or not, if it was deemed necessary for an accommodation.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So I'm going to ask this question to Veronica. What might the services look like at the college level, and can students expect them to be different than what they received in high school?
That's a really good question. And it goes back to the IEP and 504 piece. There are certain accommodations that are granted at the high school level that would not necessarily translate to the university. One example may be, and of course it's individualized. So when I give this example, don't hold me to it. But for example, a student may have access to reduced homework assignment. So in other words, the entire class is given 20 questions for homework, but this particular student that's accommodated in high school may only need to do 10. That's not something that would translate over into the university or college level, because the professor has created an assessment that's relevant to their course that they are wanting to glean from the students. And so reducing that, and we don't get into having the professors change and the departments change what their requirements are, what their standards are, how they assess, and so on. So that would be an example of an accommodation that wouldn't translate into the university setting. And there are other examples as well. But what we like to do is, and the entire group of colleagues would agree to this, is that connecting with the Disability Services Office at the university is an interactive process. So when a student presents themselves to us, there's not a prescription for how the process will work, from them connecting with the office to then receiving the accommodation. It's individualized. So some students may come in and have a conversation before they even are accepted to the university, just to kind of gauge what the campus looks like and what the accommodation process would look like. Some students don't meet at all. It just depends on the university, depends on what their needs are. So it's a little bit fluid, but any student who has questions, or any parent that has questions about the process, we encourage them to join in and ask questions. I hope that helps.
It does. That's awesome. Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add to that conversation about what services look like on the college level?
Yeah, I would maybe add there's a difference between accommodations and modifications. You know, for example, as Veronica was kind of alluding to, like if a teacher provided a test and it was a multiple choice exam and they gave the student 5 choices to choose from. A modification would be, well, the student maybe receiving special services would only have 3 options to choose from. We don't provide modifications. The student would have to take the exam as the professor is presenting it. They would have to take it in the same exam, but if there are need for accommodations, you know, extra time or distraction reduced environment, those types of things, that's what would be put in place to help level the playing field, but the student would still have to take the exam as the professor is presenting it.
And I'd like to add one more thing to that, because the IEP or the 504 that students have in high school, and it goes back to responsibility as well. Each university has a different name for what they call their letter, their accommodation letter. For WKU, it's the faculty notification letter. For the university, for U of L and UK, it may be called something different, but the entire idea behind it is the same, that the student is provided a letter with a list of accommodations and the student is responsible for providing that letter to their instructor. Whereas in high school, a lot of times there's a little bit more support. The counselor may provide that, the counselor may, or the parent may take the lead, but in a college setting, the student has the letter in their hand and they're responsible for determining which classes they would like to be accommodated in and presenting that letter to the faculty.
And I just want to add too, so some of the accommodations and services look a little different than they do in the high school for different disabilities that a lot of times weren't necessarily documented accommodations. The teacher just would let them do, you know, take care of their needs, such as, you know, if a student needs to stop the clock with, let's say they have type 1 diabetes. So a lot of times, you know, in high school, the teacher just, you know, would just let them go whenever they needed to go, but maybe to go, you know, get some something to drink, get something to eat, or you step outside, take their medicine, use the restroom. Those are all things that you know, we try to have on the letter of accommodation, and we don't take for granted. Faculty will allow them just to exit the classroom, or in some cases where we have labs, people aren't allowed to have drinks and food. So we have to make sure that that's taken into account as well. So a lot of times, you know, we find that students come out with more accommodations than they went in with, but just because it's things that were kind of taken for granted or just more informal in the high school setting that we had to kind of formalize.
So you guys are just that good, because our next question was, how does the accommodations get to the professors? So you guys have already answered our next question. So thank you for that.
I want to address that because at Jefferson it is a little bit different. So at Jefferson, the ARC is actually responsible for getting the accommodation letter to the faculty. So it is a little bit different, but we do still encourage the students to have conversations with their instructors about those accommodations.
It's a little different at Bellarmine as well. So the student will meet with us and we'll have kind of an initial meeting. And then that's when we would talk with the students about which faculty they want the accommodation letters to be emailed to. And then the letters are emailed to the faculty. And then we really strongly encourage students to then meet with the professors during their office hours to then discuss the accommodations and how they would be applied. And then each semester, because you're in new classes, we then have the student meet with us. We do a renewal And then we kind of go through the same process again, where they can decide which faculty they would like the letters to be emailed to, and then we ask them to follow up.
Thank you. Summer, for clarification, I know we had some parents who joined us after we started, and, you know, in alphabet soup, like Matt said, ARC means something different in Kentucky special education. So could you
Sure, yeah, I
give the
apologize.
name of your no, you're fine. You're fine.
So when I
just
say
wanted
ARC,
parents to know that we're not going to continue to have ARC meetings
yes,
once we get to college.
no one wants those. Yeah, so ARC for us is Accessibility Resource Center. That's the name of the disability services at Jefferson. So I say ARC. That's what I mean.
It's the same at Bellarmine also. We're ARC, Accessibility
Okay.
Resource Center. So we will use
Okay.
ARC. Yes, it is not an ARC meeting.
It is not an ARC meeting. Yeah. Right. Oh, it's my turn. All right. Colleen, in regard to online instruction, how do students access their accommodations in those settings?
I'd say for us, the process is pretty much the same as if they were in an in-person class, but some of the difference comes in working out the logistics of getting the accommodations in the online environment. So, for example, if we've got a student that uses testing accommodations, additional time, reduced distraction environment, that sort of thing, the reduced distraction environment is probably not going to be relevant if they're taking an online exam, because they can take that exam wherever they'd like to. So they can find an environment that works well for them, but the extended time does still come into play. And so that's just going to require some conversation with the faculty to find out how they're going to get that additional time in the online environment. Is there something that they need to do, like enter a password, hit ignore on a timer? Just what can they expect going into that exam? That we really encourage them to talk about ahead of time, because exams are stressful, and when things go wrong, you might panic. So we like to avoid that type of thing. Some of the other accommodations that might just be a little bit different in an online environment versus in person could be, maybe we need to do captioning for videos that are online, but in person, a student might use a note taker instead, or, things like that.
Perfect. Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add about online accessibility? I think the pandemic forced us to learn a whole lot about how to provide accommodations virtually, right?
There's a question from a parent, it looks like. Do we wait until the end to answer those?
Let's answer that. What's the turnaround time from when a student shares documentation with the school's disability center and when the accommodations are acknowledged for the class or classes? Anyone?
For
I had
Bellarmine,
a student in my office actually today. We just now did an intake. Not uncommon, right? But right after midterms, but before finals. And the student's name may or may not have been Sam. And I said, this process will work at the speed of Sam. Right? So it's as fast as the student letting the professor know.
Okay.
for us, I will say that, once the documentation is submitted, the student has to schedule an intake, schedule an appointment with us. And so that might be sometimes, depending on the time of the semester, it might slow the process down, because at the very beginning of the semester, it is extremely busy. So it's just when the availability is with the staff in that particular disability office. I'm sure everyone probably experiences similar issues. But there are, once the documentation is available, once the intake is completed, we're sending out the email to the faculty at that time. So it really is, we all of us encourage students get that documentation into us as quickly as possible. Get those appointments scheduled with us as quickly as possible so that you have those accommodations in place as early in the semester as possible. And we have students still coming in this week. Like you had said that, I mean, you have the right to come into our office at any time with the documentation, and then we'll schedule those appointments and complete the intake. And from that point forward in our office, you have those accommodations.
Thank you.
I agree with
thank you
everything
to
that's
Ms.
been
Swinga for
said.
asking a great question.
I was just going to add that, you know, for students that are looking at, you know, starting in the fall semester, for example, that there's nothing to stop those students from starting to gather documentation and send that stuff to us. We usually say, well, let's have our meeting after you've actually registered for classes so we can get specific and finish everything that we need to do for the fall. But this summer is a great time to have some of those meetings in our office, and then that way everything's ready for the start of the very first semester.
Also, housing
All right, Dr.
accommodations.
Crow from
sorry.
WKU, you're up. What happens if a student chooses not to use their accommodations?
Well, they have that right, much to the chagrin of faculty at times, I suppose, but I always use the term activate their accommodations. They may want it, as we've said, for one class, and they really don't need it for another class. Sometimes students may want to transition from high school to college, and I want to give this a try without having any accommodations. I want to do this on my own, and we certainly encourage and empower students to do that. If they decide midterm or halfway through the semester or the year that I really do need these accommodations now, some of the things I'd like to explore that's an appropriate time too, but students cannot use their accommodations also. We want to support and advocate what the students want and what their needs are. So that would be my quick response to that question.
If I may, also, the students absolutely have that right. You can sign up for accommodations with us, register with our office, and choose to pick and choose. What we do stress, though, is we can't retroactively apply those accommodations. So if you've chosen not to use them, we respect that. However, we can't then go back in time and make changes from the past.
Thank you, Krista. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this question to anyone. If a student chooses not to use accommodations one semester, then they decide they need them the next semester, and you've covered this pretty well. Do they simply ask? Is there a different process? Do they have to, like, if they refuse, do they need to then reinitiate? What is your process?
I would say it depends on the university setting. For us, we have a faculty notification letter that's available to the student once they've registered and their accommodations have been approved and written, and they're able to use that letter throughout their academic career. It sounds like other universities may have a different process, but if a student chooses not to use their accommodations one semester but decides the next, they still have that letter in hand.
Yeah, our letters don't expire. We only ask that, we make our letters available online through an online portal. And most students are able to pull those off at any point they want to, anytime during the year. We do have some that are custom that they have to request from their consultant, but the fact that they don't use them one year and would the next, that wouldn't have any impact on or any, we wouldn't have any issue with that.
Yeah, for us, a student, they would not need to register with our office again or provide any new documentation. They would just need to contact our office and request those accommodations that they're seeking for that particular semester.
The only instance that I could see that maybe we would request updated documentation is if the student left the university for a while and came back. At that point, we might want to, depending on the time frame, but we might ask for updated information if they're returning.
Okay. All right, Dr. Beach, you were kind of passed over on a question because they jumped over it. So I'm gonna let you lead off this one. And we kind of talked a little bit about this, but what is the doctors? Good Lord, people, I'm sorry. What what is the parents' role in this whole process?
So, I think that's a great question. One of the parents' roles, I think a lot of it is leading up to the first day is helping your student understand and advocate for what they need in terms of accommodations, and working with them to, because it's a big step from going to the high school setting to going to a setting where many of at UK we require the students to hand their letter to their faculty and encourage them to have a conversation, and that may be difficult for many people. So, and a lot of people don't know, a lot of students come and don't really understand what their disability looks like. So I think that's a big role for the parents, is to help the student along the way. And then some of it, a lot of it's help them be an advocate, and then being a good cheerleader, understanding that at this point in college, most federal privacy laws, we have to work with the student, and the parent doesn't have the active role that they had maybe in high school. So we certainly encourage parents to communicate with their student, but understanding that we're limited in how much we can talk, and of course all direction of the student's program is their choice, and we certainly encourage them to take into account the support of multiple people, including their family. But it does change just a little bit, because there are expectations that they'll be able to manage many of these situations on their own. And if they haven't already learned how to wake up to an alarm clock, that would be a bad idea either.
Does anybody else have anything to share about that?
I would just add a few things. I think teaching the student to self-advocate, Dr. Beach was exactly right. A good way to do that, and the literature suggests that it may actually be the #1 factor on whether an individual with a disability graduates from college, is if they sit in on their own IEP meeting. So that especially when they're juniors and seniors, if they sit in on their own meeting, so that they know, okay, this is what my disability looks like, this is what the accommodations are, this is what all these experts are saying. I think that's a really good thing you can do to get your student prepared for self-advocacy. And I'd also just throw out there that I'm a big fan of parents. I'm a big fan of moms. I have one. And the way I look at it is, when a student comes to my office as a college freshman, sure, this is my time to help that individual and accommodate that individual, but I certainly realize that the parents have been doing exactly that, for the students the past 18, 19 years. And so I appreciate that.
Okay, just for the group at large, how does the college communicate with parents, or do they?
Matt, I just wanted to spiral off of something that you said, and it's related to this question, Kim. I think sometimes we higher ed give parents a bad rap, that we We have all kinds of names for you: helicopter, stealth bomber, bulldozer. We have all kinds of these negative names for parents. And it's unfortunate. You know, I'm a mom, Matt, so I'm looking at this from my lens too of my son's 12. So when he gets to your campus, I have a certain expectation of how I expect you to greet him and welcome him and support him and challenge him. So I think that informs my role a little bit differently the past 12 years than it did the prior 20 years. So, you know, there are certain things that we can communicate with you about, and there are certain things we cannot. We have a FERPA release form. FERPA is a federal law mandate that says that we can only communicate with parents when the students give us permission, because the universities, colleges and universities see students as adults. When they come to our universities, they are considered adults. Whether you're paying the bill or not, they're considered adults. And so we need to get permission in order to communicate with you. FERPA covers educational records and the like, but we want, I guess, in a broad statement, we want to work with parents. We don't, I always say I come from the housing background, and oftentimes those magical 3 months, May, June, and July, before they come to our college campuses, we, higher education, thinks that this mystical process happens and all of a sudden they graduate from high school and they're adults. I affectionately call 18-year-olds adults in training. I didn't have it all together at 18. So how would we higher education possibly think that something magical has occurred in that summer when they embark on our campuses, that they have it all together? You did the best you could for 18 years, 19 years. And now it's, as I often say, leave them in our very capable and caring and nurturing hands. Leave them in our very capable hands, but we want to partner with you. And we want to respect your involvement, and we want to be conscious of your concerns and your questions. However, in addition to that, we are also in place to help support and encourage your students to be their own best advocate and to be their own best cheerleader. And we will shepherd them and help them along as best we can. So I think we all want to, the people on this, my colleagues on this call, want to be partners and supporters with you. And we don't want an adversarial relationship. But we will also challenge and nurture and support your student to be those young adult people that when they graduate and earn their degrees from our fine institutions, they're going to go move and shake the world. And they have, so we want to partner with you, regardless of what people say about higher education parents.
Kim,
Dr. Peggy, that was the great answer. I don't even know what to say to that.
Kim,
all right.
Can I add
So
something?
the last question that we have before we look at our breakout sessions, and I think this is even more important than it ever has been, are what kind of mental health supports are there on your campus? And again, I'm just leaving that open to the floor.
We have at Bellarmine, there is, I'm sure most have this, a counseling center that's on campus, and the services are free to students. They do tend to focus more on brief therapy. And so if it looks like something that's more long-term, they'll work with the students to find a provider in the community that would be able to work with them. But, it can be ongoing in working with the counseling center. We also, within our office, provide consultations, and that's not therapy. However, if you're, if your student is experiencing some anxiety or test anxiety and they're needing to process it a little bit, or they're just really confused about school and what's going on, we serve as a consultant to the students as well, which I'm sure all of you do. There's a counseling center at Bellarmine.
So we just kind of reimagined our services related to mental health We would, like most of our folks here, we do have a counseling center. It's a wonderful counseling center. They, many very talented folks. We provide some face-to-face, a lot of groups out of that, but we've also expanded our wellness piece, which is focusing on prevention, and addressing stress and well-being prior to the point that that functioning begins to be impacted negatively. We also just started an affiliation with Talkspace, which is an online counseling service, and seeing a lot of positive, a lot of use out of it, which was kind of surprising. But we're seeing that as a very helpful tool because it just has a lot more availability than than our counseling center does in terms of the students have more access to clinicians at times sometimes that are more helpful for them. And then we've also developed a crisis stabilization sort of, I don't want to call it a unit because it's just one person, but we do have a kind of a triage person that if a student gets into point that they're in crisis or is having some severe anxiety or some type of significant issue, then that person is referred to our triage person, and they'll help. They can provide brief counseling or determine whether the individual needs further services somewhere else.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? Right, so I'm going to stop our recording